final in our series, Zero Waste, Building a Better Community. My name is Dean Amel. I'm the Solid Waste Chair for the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club, and I've been a member of Arlington's Solid Waste Committee since about 1990. I'll make just a few introductory comments before turning this over to our moderator for the evening. First, let me acknowledge the 5 groups sponsoring this series. They are EcoAction Arlington, the Alliance for Regional Cooperation, the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions, Leaders in Energy, and the Potomac River Group of the Sierra Club. So tonight's event focuses on reimagining our waste management systems. If you didn't get the chance to participate in the first 2 webinars in the series, Building a Circular Economy and Beyond Recycling, you can find recordings of those programs on EcoAction Arlington's YouTube page, and I believe Catherine is going to put a link to those in our chat. So tonight's agenda will be as follows. We'll have some opening remarks from Carrie Thompson, our moderator. Then we'll hear from our 2 guest speakers and our commenter. This will be followed by a moderated discussion among our speakers, and then we'll close with a Q&A session with audience questions from you. So without further ado, I'll introduce our moderator and turn the evening over to her. Carrie Thompson served for over 30 years as a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Agency for International Development. Her final leadership role at AID involved responsibility for the agency's global environment and economic growth programs. Carrie currently sits on the boards of EcoAction Arlington and the Marine Debris Foundation, and she co-chairs Arlington's Climate Change, Energy, and Environment, or C2E2 Commission. As C2E2 co-chair, Carrie chairs the Commission's Solid Waste Committee, which is advising Arlington on development of a new solid waste plan that will launch in 2024. Carrie also works as an external advisor to a management consulting firm on issues relating to climate change and interdimensional development. So over to you, Carrie.
Thanks so much, Dean, for the kind introduction. I'm actually the vice chair of C2E2. I must have written that wrong again. Today's program explores how municipalities can seek to advance toward a circular economy and reduce carbon emissions by addressing the challenges associated with getting to zero waste, which is generally defined as diverting 90% or more of material from the landfill or incinerator. The key challenges to overcome in this regard are too much goes into the bins in the first place, and a substantial portion of what goes into the recycling bin, particularly single-use plastics, can't be recycled. And our current waste management systems can't yet successfully divert enough of the post-recycling residuals from the landfill or incinerator. I'm going to ask Joan to share a graphic that we presented during our last webinar. Some of you may remember it, to help illustrate what's becoming clear is the needed solution set to these problems. The graphic is an updated version of the well-known inverted waste management pyramid, which was developed by the Zero Waste International Alliance. This new pyramid adds, before the first 2 of the 3 traditional R's, reduce and reuse, a first new rung titled Rethink and Redesign as relates to our consumer products and packaging. It also further differentiates the rungs following recycle and compost into material recovery, residual management, and unacceptable. It's the first time I've seen it labeled as such, which refers to waste to energy and other incineration. The solutions to the 2 problems, therefore, are to significantly improve the steps before recycling, to reduce the overall volume of material going into the bins, and after recycling, to improve management of the residuals. It's key, of course, to continue improving recycling, but the potential game changers are in the 2 areas I mentioned. While many of us increasingly consider the environmental impacts of our consumption and our waste disposal practices, it's becoming very clear that no matter how diligent we are about trying to recycle right, we're never going to recycle our way out of the waste problem. What we need to do, therefore, as the title of today's webinar suggests, is to reimagine our waste management system. A couple of final observations as part of setting the stage. I mentioned at the beginning that carbon emissions are also reduced as municipalities successfully reduce waste. This is also true for methane, of course. As we develop our new solid waste plan here in Arlington County, and Eric will tell you a lot more about that later, we are also looking at the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions alongside waste reduction as we consider which actions we should prioritize. And also as relates to carbon emissions and consumption, the New York Times recently published a map, some of you might have seen it, that shows total carbon emissions, including all categories of consumption by locale. It may come as a surprise, but it probably shouldn't, that there's a strong association between affluence and the capacity for consumption that it affords and carbon emissions. It gives the Tesla drivers among us something to consider. So let's move on now to our speakers. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to make a quick procedural point. I encourage audience members to post questions or comments in the chat as the speakers are winding up their remarks, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible during the Q&A session in the last half hour or so of the program. So without further ado, it's my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Andy Smith. Andy is the Interim Recycling and Environmental Services Section Manager of King County, Washington State. Thanks for coming from so far away, Andy. Andy is the co-sponsor of the county's RePlus program, which he'll tell us about, and leads the King County Solid Waste Division's work on recycling programs, environmental stewardship, and compliance. His bio lists a series of notable programs his division implements that are relevant to tonight's discussion, including extended producer responsibility, waste prevention, and resource recovery, among others. Finally, as won't be a surprise once he speaks, prior to assuming his current role, Andy was a senior policy advisor to the UK government, working on UK, EU, and international climate targets, clean growth, sustainable trade, among other topics. The floor is yours, Andy.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Just doing a sound check. Everyone can hear me okay. Please shout if yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up. Awesome. So yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and in the age of Zoom, this is often when the wheels come off slightly with technology. So hopefully that's not going to be us today. Let me activate my presentation. And then hopefully what you're all seeing is a rather nice animation showing what RePlus is. I'm probably going to do a much better job than me of trying to explain it to you. And before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples and would like to honor with gratitude this land itself and the tribal members past and present by promising that while I'm here, I will be a respectful visitor and steward of the environment. As I said, I'm here to talk about the new county program called RePlus. In essence, when you think about all of the ways to reduce waste, they all start with re. You could recycle that piece of paper, reuse that water bottle, you can repair that bike, restore that piece of furniture, reduce your consumption in the first place. Essentially, rethink all the items that you purchase. RePlus is really a way of capturing all of these rewords. And I think we like to say, you know, before you throw that thing away, see if you can RePlus it instead. You know, and as mentioned in the introduction, you know, delivering that RePlus mission is incredibly important part of our reducing the effects of and also the likelihood of climate change. So in King County, we have really connected less waste in the landfill, you know, not just about sort of reducing carbon dioxide and methane, but actually just reducing our overall carbon footprint altogether. You know, King County wants to achieve and deliver its part of the landmark Paris Agreement, which really sort of sets us all the challenge of delivering our emissions. And so for goods, services, and materials, that means looking at emissions, not just where they occur at their sort of final end use or disposal, which we often do in the waste management world, but rather looking at the life cycle. As the if you have seen the New York Times article around consumption emissions, we are one of the jurisdictions that have been doing work in this place. So when we updated our greenhouse gas inventory, we also included a consumptions emissions analysis toolkit to identify what the consumption emissions are in King County. So taking account of the emissions emitted to create or move the goods and services, transportation, housing, and food that are consumed in King County. We think that by using this lens ensures that we're taking all of the mitigation actions and to make sure that actions are not lost. So a good example might be thinking about buying that electric vehicle, or when the county's making a decision to electrify the bus fleet. That's not emissions free. There's no tailpipe emissions, which is awesome, but there are embedded emissions within that choice. And making sure that when we apply that lens, we're thinking about over the life cycle of a product, service, or good, we're taking decisions sustainably. So then coming back to sort of the materials that are currently sent to landfill, well, we think around 70% of the materials that are currently sent to the King County landfill could be recycled. We have codes to say that actually up to 70% should be diverted elsewhere. We also think that that 70% often includes materials that could be prevented altogether or reused. And when we look at it from that lens, we really see there are significant tons being sent to landfill. Food, plastic, paper, yard waste in particular really rise to the top. So that is really our focus. The challenge is so large, we have to choose where to start. So we're starting with those priority materials. We also want to be thinking about this in terms of the circular economy. So thinking about sort of reducing as possible the amount of materials that are used in the first place, but then the materials that are used, keeping them in use for as long as possible. And we sort of recognize that means kind of connecting with partners, building the system together. I work in the solid waste division, and the solid waste division for sure has a part to play in delivering a more circular economy, but so does working in partnership with producers in order to create better product design, or working in partnership with our partners in the department that I'm in, natural resources and parks, to ensure that we're delivering support for renewable energy, for example. When we do that, and when we start thinking about all of these different kind of co-benefits that come from a more circular economy, and in terms of delivering that 70% goal, we start to think about it in terms of co-benefits. And these are the things that we found the residents of King County want to hear about. Saying that we want to reduce tons by 800,000 going to landfill doesn't really resonate with people. But when we say, actually, those 800,000 tons, if they were sort of sent for reuse or recycled, we could be creating over 500 green jobs in order to manage that material. People start to listen a bit more. Thinking about all of those food tons which go to landfill, converting that into meals for people who are going hungry at night, that could represent meals for 92,000 people. So this is the sort of messaging that we really want to ensure that when we're communicating around the zero waste agenda and the circular economy agenda, we're communicating in a way that sort of is going to resonate with people. So just a quick note on some of the programs that we already have before going on to what we're working on for Root Plus. So we have a long history in the region of product stewardship, in particular coordination around something called the Northwest Product Stewardship Council. And this is a group of like-minded governments and jurisdictions that really want to redefine responsibility for material management. And so through this group, we have seen programs around e-cycling and paint, product stewardship, and also around light bulbs. And we also see huge potential for that to be expanded into packaging and paper products. So we have folk who are working on those programs. And so policy is a huge and important ingredient for the work that we're doing. We also lean specifically into waste prevention. So I put on this slide a few things that we work on. So we run with care events, we support tool libraries. We've just awarded a grant to build a second tool library with our partner. We also do integrate waste prevention work into schools programs. So we have two schools programs, one looking at the curriculum, and so that's really the sort of like hearts and minds of students. And we also have a schools program that is looking to decarbonize and also set up recycling programs for schools as well. We also really recognize the kind of importance role organics plays, and so we have a market development program for compost called CompostWise. So in particular, recognizing that if you divert a material, you need to have something useful for it to do. And so the role of jurisdictions in order to drive markets is one that we recognize. King County is also part of the Pacific Coast Collaboration. And so this is a group of states and cities and counties on the West Coast, which is trying to achieve climate targets through a various number of different activities. And so we're going to be coordinating on food waste in particular. For those familiar with the RAP program in the UK, it's sort of modeled on that. So working with partners in order to, so for example, supermarkets, thinking about how food is presented in supermarkets, encouraging food donation, so food isn't wasted at the end of the supermarket day. And then we have our outreach programs. So in particular, Food Too Good to Waste. And we're really leaning into trans creation of content. So making sure that we're reflecting all of the communication needs of the communities in King County. And then finally, we have our Green Tools program, which covers all sorts of different implementation work around construction and demolition, providing technical assistance to King County jurisdictions, also running a code collaboration so the cities and jurisdictions of the region can coordinate much better. There's also a focus on education and workshops, so providing sort of workshops for C&D and building industry in order to bring together jurisdictional experts as well as the private sector experts. But then, all of that sounds great, but King County actually has hit a little bit of a plateau. So as you can see from this graph, our recycling rate really hasn't increased all that much for a decade. And so this is really part of the sort of impetus for us to move into this new sort of focus. So RE+ in particular. So as you can see, we have a sort of what you might sort of think of a sort of expected approach for mission and vision, but we really want to try and create and place zero waste and circularity within the context of what people are interested in King County, and in particular how to integrate the zero waste agenda with climate and also with community. Now, we've been approaching that from a just transition perspective. And so this is really sort of thinking about traditionally in the solid waste division, we're interested in trying to create waste-free, low-carbon King County. But also in King County, we are responsible for delivering a just, equitable future for all. And so if you only concentrate on on either one of those objectives, you're going to miss lots of opportunities to co-create and co-deliver work for our residents. So when you sort of are deliberate and intentional about creating those two visions together, we understand that to mean a just transition. And so what we're trying to do is, as we develop programs, ensure that we're sort of bringing that just transition lens to the work that we're doing. So a little bit as a summary about what's in the RE+ plan. So we've got proposals around collection changes for single-family organics, creating a technical assistance program for commercial entities. So Washington State passed law in the last session to say that all commercial generators in King County, but of jurisdictions that are have a beyond a minimum threshold, need to provide service. We think there's actually an opportunity here, and we've sort of learned from others who have done this that actually the focus might be to provide service. So, food waste is diverted. That's actually an opportunity to talk to generators to get them to look at their practices and reduce waste and do waste prevention. We also are eager to see more extended producer responsibility, so that sort of product stewardship lens, as well as thinking about what processing infrastructure we need for food waste. That huge amount of kind of food which is currently sent to landfill, we hope we'll be able to reduce that, but we are going to need infrastructure to process it if we aren't successful with that. Also, the market development and business development side, so partnering to create statewide action that we call next cycle, and then really sort of leaning into community co-design for a range of our work, not just the communities in King County, but working in partnership nationally. So, for example, we're a founding member of the US Plastics Pact, and so really trying to develop that kind of group of institutions and organizations to move on this work together. So thinking about community, just for a moment, we've set up a community panel. These were folk drawn from frontline communities and the communities most exposed to the impacts of climate change to help develop proposals. Also recognizing that in King County, we have a population of 2.2 million. Seattle is in King County, but we do have 49 other cities. So making sure that we're working in partnership with the region is hugely important. And then also creating space for us to talk about good ideas. We have our formal advisory group, but actually not having the space for us to sort of talk to one another about good ideas has been a challenge. One of the things we've just sort of finished our first round on is circular economy grants. So this is, it was a competitive process. It was launched last year, and it's essentially for projects. We have two tracks, one around prevention reuse, one about recycling downstream. We've awarded around $2.3 million for 14 projects, and the projects were up to $300,000 each. We used a co-design process to co-create this grant and the specifications for the grant with representatives from frontline communities and local businesses. We then handed over the sort of decision-making power to groups to help advise on which groups should be awarded grants, and that we think hopefully is a model we want to use more of. And then, as I mentioned, the Next Cycle program, which is really this community, they're trying to create this space where community-based organizations, businesses, and individuals, innovators can really work together to create that real vision for a circular economy. And as part of that, there's sort of two elements. So one is a circular accelerator, very similar to the low carbon accelerators that I think are very, very popular. So really looking at a curated program of support and to advance circular economy business opportunities of the future. Again, we sort of separated into upstream, downstream. So really making sure that prevention and reuse is an important component, at least 50% of the work that we're doing. And then also seed grants. These are sort of under decision right now. So the application phase was over, and this is mini grants up to $10,000. We're going to award probably 14 to 18 of them. And they're intended for sort of, small startups to really get on the the sort of journey of circularity. I wanted to finish on the sort of question of how to engage kind of communities. So one of the things that we did is that we engaged EMC research on sort of a number of things. We have a lot of sort of data around this, but I wanted to sort of make one final point, which is King County, we generally have quite a lot of support for this agenda. So around, as you can see from the slide, around 63% of folk either strongly or somewhat support the work of the division and in particular around RE+. But if you look at the chart, there's a huge number of people that don't really know, haven't really heard of, not quite sure what to think. So what we found is after we've told them all of this work that we're doing and, you know, whether they support or don't support, in King County at least, we see a significant increase. And I think sometimes we in the public sector in jurisdictions are told, well, actually, there's not much support out there. It's very difficult. You don't have the sort of evidence to do that. One of the reasons we went out to find out what the public thought is we want to make sure that we are delivering this change agenda and messaging that folk understood. And what we found is when we go out and we talk to people about it, there is overwhelming support in King County for this program and programs like it. And so hopefully that is a good news thing to sort of end with. I've talked very, very, very quickly. I've gone over my 15 minutes and I have to apologize to the organizers for doing that. I forgot to set my timer, so I'm very sorry for doing that, highly unprofessional of me. But my details are on the screen. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions. I haven't been looking at the chat, and so I'm going to stop speaking now and hand back to you, Carrie.
Andy, thanks so much for your presentation. It's clear that under your leadership, King County is doing a lot of very innovative things. I loved your final comments about your ability to measure the impacts of sharing more information about what you're doing. That's something that Arlington County is thinking of prioritizing as we move forward. So that's great input. So we'll move on to our next speaker, and we'll be saving any more specific questions for later. So thank you, Andy. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Sophia Hossain, the Zero Waste Manager for Baltimore, Maryland, a little closer to home for us. Sophia joined Baltimore City's Department of Public Works as their first Zero Waste Manager in November 2022, so just recently, leading the Office of Waste Diversion. Previously, she worked with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, where she led the Baltimore Composting for Community project. Before that, she served in Baltimore City's Office of Sustainability on their Food Matters program in partnership with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Sophia is passionate about enriching and empowering communities through circular economies and sustainable food systems. Over to you, Sophia.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. Sophia Hossain. I am Baltimore City's first Zero Waste Manager, and I started here in November. So this is actually my first presentation that I'm giving in the role. So if I'm a little bit nervous, that is why. Today, I wanted to talk about, our current waste diversion programming, what our upcoming priorities are, especially in terms of infrastructure. I wanted to talk a little bit about our outreach strategies and just our people-centered movements, and then some of the challenges that we're facing. So on the screen now, you'll see an analysis of kind of what our trash makeup is. And this is from 2014, so I anticipate that it's changed a little bit. But what's really important is that about 75% of what is in the residential curbside trash is compostable, recyclable, or reusable. And so, let me get my slides. Just a quick overview of some of our waste diversion activities. The Office of Waste Diversion is new. So this is kind of an amalgamation of things we were doing across some different offices before that they've now consolidated into the Office of Waste Diversion. And our primary and newest program is this food scrap drop-off program, which features decentralized locations across the city. In the top left of the screen, you can kind of see what that looks like. These are housed at our convenience centers. And our convenience centers are really like recycling and disposal hubs for citizens, where we offer recycling for hard to manage materials like batteries, electronics. We're also doing oyster shells there. We run a program for Christmas trees every season. You can also bring your bulk trash and recyclables there as well. Something that we've partnered on, but we didn't lead, is we recently passed a plastic bag ban in Baltimore City, which we're really happy about, as well as a styrofoam ban. We also lead shred events where people can shred their paper, which are very, very popular, believe it or not. We host a monthly Trash Talk Tuesday, where we talk about ways to recycle, reuse, or reduce people's trash at home. We also do a re-newsletter. We do spring and fall cleanups across the city. And the sustainability sub-cabinet is actually, it's one of my favorite things that we do. It's an interagency partnership where we talk about how to implement zero waste and waste diversion strategies across government agencies. So we're working with the Department of General Services and the Department of Transportation right now to figure out ways that we can embed zero waste practices as a government agency across the board. So I think there's a lot of potential there to do some good stuff. We also do home composting workshops through our Grow Center. We recently distributed recycling carts. You can see that in the bottom left here, to the entire city of Baltimore, which was a really exciting incentive program for people to start recycling more. And then we were also part of the Food Matters program, which was originally put on by NRDC and the Rockefeller Foundation. So that's just a little overview. We have set some food waste diversion is one of our most robust and popular programs. And so I'll spend a good amount of time just talking about that. We do have some goals set in both our Baltimore food waste reduction strategy and our sustainability plan. And so that is looking at 100 to 80% diversion across the higher ed to residential sector by 2040. We always want to prioritize reduction. And so you'll see those that reduction prioritized in the earlier years in 2030. One of the most important things that I can't emphasize enough is data tracking. And, you know, as far ahead as you can think about implementing data tracking strategies, the better you'll be. So for example, right now, there was a piece of legislation that was passed last year called HB 264, which requires large-scale food waste generators to divert their food waste residues to an organics recycling facility if one exists within 30 miles. It's really exciting. So in 2023, the threshold is 2,000 pounds a week. And in 2024, it'll go down to 1,000 pounds and so on and so forth, continuing to get less and less. But one of the problems that we're experiencing is we don't really know how much food waste large scale generators are creating. And so getting a head start on that data tracking and then using that data to implement your programming is great. And I'm talking like front of line solutions as well as back of line solutions. So, and as much detail as you can embed into your data tracking programs is really helpful. We're looking at potentially doing an incentive program where we give scales to large scale food waste generators and set them up with like a digital data tracking service to start collecting some of this data as we begin implementing HB 264. We always, in line with the circular principles, always want to focus on the highest and best reuse. So with our residential engagement around food waste, we always emphasize the source reduction. Here's just like a little snippet of a poster series that we had done and distributed at libraries and community centers. And then we, edible food rescue is the next priority, and then we get to composting. And one really cool food rescue program that we did was at our farmers market. We have a food scrap collection program, and we worked with a local hog farmer in Baltimore County who takes all of that food that we compost at the farmers market and feeds her hogs. And we're talking thousands of pounds of food waste, and unbelievably, it only feeds her hogs for half the week. So, so that program has some room for expansion, but it's a really great creative reuse model. And it happened very organically. She has been attending the farmers markets for years, and we built that relationship right there at the farmers market. We were working with a hauler before, so really cool kind of community driven program, even though it is being facilitated at the government level. So love that one. And then on the right here, you'll see Mr. Marvin Hayes from the Baltimore Compost Collective leading a youth workshop on composting at Filbert Street Garden. And a cool thing about Filbert Street Garden is the city just passed on ownership of that garden to the community there. So that's one way that we're kind of trying to promote community stewardship and yeah, reward people who are kind of leading the way. In Baltimore, it's interesting. A lot of the food waste diversion effort has really been community led. And it's like the government is only just catching up on supporting this movement with the infrastructure and the capacity to do it at the larger scale. And so the ecosystem in Baltimore of composting is, we have several hauler businesses that are doing a great job. They are already working with universities and some of the large scale food waste generators to divert their organics. And then we also have a community, a decentralized community scale composting network, which is the map here that you can see, which is, they're mostly located at urban farms, and they are collecting food waste from the community and processing it by hand in usually 3 bin systems at farms across the city. A couple are located at churches as well. And so what I love about this is, like, the composting process is driven by microorganisms and mycelium, and you really see the way that this community movement has kind of propagated throughout Baltimore at the farm level, at the food production level, in the schools, and really created the case for compost use in Baltimore, created the case for soil ecology and soil health, and tied that into resilient food systems. And we really saw a lot of that kind of spring into action when COVID hit, and when local food production became really important, and local food rescue and food distribution became the name of the game. It's really all of our farms and a lot of our nonprofits kind of transitioned to that work. So here on the left, you can see Farmer John at Strength to Love Farm. And then on the right, you can see this was a composting workshop for the youth at Northside Baptist Church in Baltimore. So let's see. Another really great example of just community-led movement was the development of the Baltimore's Fair Development Plan for Zero Waste, which was adopted by the mayor. And this was really led by the zero waste advocates in South Baltimore, who have been, advocating for the incinerator to shut down, advocating for us to move towards more sustainable ways of being as a city. And I think we're really responsible for creating my position at the city level. It's been this constant pressure to move away from incineration. And so here I am. I'm really glad that, that pressure can turn into something really, I know it's difficult for governments to deal with it sometimes, but it turned into something really positive for us. And I give them a lot of credit for where we are today. So I just want to give another kind of creative reuse, higher reuse model example here. So this is Camp Small. This is a Rec and Parks program. And they have a 4-acre site. You can see their site over on the right. It's piled high with wood waste, and they take all of Rec and Parks trees that they fall down or that fell, or shrubbery, things like that, is all collected here. And they've built a kiln. They DIY'd a kiln, and they are drying ash to sell for construction. And they have found that they cannot dry ash fast enough. And actually the whole ash is there's a story behind that. There's the emerald ash borer that has kind of decimated the ash population in Baltimore. And so there's been this abundance of ash trees that have fallen, and they sell all of their ash before it's even done drying in the kiln. And here on the left, you can see they created this like Montessori play ground for a local school as well. And then in the middle photo, you can see not really up to terms on this, but for people who spin wood into bowls, those are kind of the blanks that they use for those. And so you can see all these models of like higher reuse, higher value for the woody material in this operation. And it's been like very grassroots, very slow over time, kind of building capacity. And so now, as we look towards the future, one thing that I think Camp Small has done a really good job of is creating a carbon bank to kind of prime the city's natural resources to adopt composting next. So we're looking at ways where we can manage, their wood waste that is not used at the higher level to drive composting momentum in the city. So exciting things there. Yeah, so I touched on this just a little bit. Upcoming infrastructural needs that we're looking at are mini MRFs, a construction demolition facility, and then composting infrastructure. So mini MRFs, not full-size MRFs, because in the city of Baltimore, we're a little bit limited on space and capacity. So for mini MRFs, you need about 5,000 square feet. We can have a decentralized network across the city. And it also, from like a cost perspective, is much more affordable in the short term. You can kind of build on capacity as time goes on. So that's something that we're looking at. The C&D facility, we found that about 40% of what we landfill is C&D materials. And in partnership with our Department of Transportation, we really see value and revenue derived from being able to reuse that aggregate material for paving and other construction projects at the city level. And then composting infrastructure, of course, is a big one that we're talking about. We're in the process of doing a capped landfill assessment to see where we might be able to house a composting operation. Again, the city is a little bit strapped for acreage. So depending on where you are, that is a reality that you may have to deal with. We're looking at 4-acre parcels. That's about the biggest that we've got. And so we would be looking at developing a decentralized system of composting facilities. I anticipate we'll need about 4 of them. What else do I have? Legislatively, I mentioned HB 264, which is essentially, it's a disposal ban for large-scale food waste producers, and that kicked into effect just January 1st, 2023. So we are doing outreach to businesses on that legislation now. I think I'll share this. This isn't a program that we did, but it is a program that Montgomery County trialed. They, for their first year, when they had an organics disposal mandate, they subsidized the cost for those businesses to employ haulers. So for a year, the city paid for those businesses for their hauling service, and then that allowed for them to kind of scale into compliance. And provided an incentive for them to really start this program because they were getting a free service. So I really like that model, and it's something that we're considering here in Baltimore. There's an extended producer responsibility. There's several extended producer responsibility bills that we're looking at. Also disposal bans for compostable and recyclable materials. We are looking at a mattress disposal ban. So preventing us from sending mattresses to the landfill. It's a really inefficient use of landfill space. And there's actually a company in Baltimore that has this proprietary mechanism for separating out all the different materials, the metal and the fluff and the textiles for mattresses and selling them to end markets. So we're excited to be able to hopefully participate in that program, write the repair bills where people have access to materials and documents to repair their own electronics. A big one for us as we shift away from incineration as a method for dealing with our trash is taking another look at the renewable energy portfolio standards and removing incineration as a tier 1 renewable energy. That will, I think, obviously that incentivizes incineration. We're looking to move away from that sort of structure. So that's a big one that we're looking at. Another loop that I would really like to close just with the circular economy in mind is glass recycling. I've talked to a lot of people who are working on shoreline restoration, which is of the utmost importance here in the Bay Area, in the Chesapeake Bay Area. And sand, the cost of sand is really, really expensive for them. And they're looking at other materials that they can use to do shoreline restoration. And so one of those is glass recycling into sand. It doesn't require any fancy color sorting technology. You just kind of grind it up and it's good to go. The other thing that we're working with for shoreline restoration in particular, I'll just mention it, is they can use shrubbery and brush and tree material to mimic habitats on the shoreline too. So that's another higher use carbon thing that we're looking at. Also green business certifications, and then adjusting the Maryland Recycling Act currently does not have construction and demolition materials listed as a recyclable material that we can track towards our recycling rate. So we're looking at amending that bill as well. I may have talked a little fast, but and yeah, thank you.
Sophia, that was a fantastic presentation. You covered a lot of territory. It really stood out how much the community in and around Baltimore is pushing the reforms. I noted that myself, and then you actually stated it. And so that's quite interesting. And also the emphasis on urban farming and food. And so thank you so much. Lots of questions, but we're going to keep on moving, and we'll get to the questions later. I look forward to it. A lot are coming in on the chat. Last but not least, it's my real pleasure to introduce as our commenter tonight someone with whom I've been working closely to advance zero waste principles here in Arlington, Eric Grabowski, Chief of Arlington County Solid Waste Bureau. Eric will offer Arlington's perspective on the speaker's comments tonight. Eric has served in his current position for almost 20 years, during which time he has initiated a 4 C's strategy of providing convenient, comprehensive, cost-effective, and conservation-minded services to the community. He and his team have achieved many successes implementing Arlington's current solid waste management plan. His work has resulted in Arlington being recognized and awarded multiple times as a regional leader in solid waste management. Such successes have included the introduction of curbside single stream recycling, organics and food scraps collection, food scraps is new, and e-waste collection, as well as the launch of a single stream recycling by commercial and multifamily sectors. Eric, please take it away.
Barry, thank you very much. Hey, I just want to really thank Andy and Sophia. They did a great job of kind of talking about this subject, and it's not easy, and we're going to talk a little about that. So I actually want to put this whole subject in a little bit of context and then talk a little bit about Arlington County and where we are. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
So this is what I'm going to talk about, a little background and history from just solid waste overall. There are zero waste goal, regulatory requirements, planning, community participation, and planning timelines, and also getting to 90% diversion, which is really in context of what we're all talking about and how we do that. So here's some factoids. The national recycling rate is only 32% in 2020. To go from 32 to 90 is hard. It's a big lift. The national goal they just recently set was to get a 50% recycling rate by 2030. Virginia's reported state rate was 43.3, and interestingly enough, California's rate 2021, the same year, was only 40%. Arlington's reported rate for in 2021 was 52.4%. Not as good as King County, which was at 54%, but we're doing pretty well, and everybody has their own unique challenges. And again, you can see that our recycling rate was only 31.7% in 2002. So over 20 years, we've basically only gone up 21%, or about a percentage per year. Again, this is not easy stuff. So let's talk about the evolution of solid waste management. I'm going to take you back 35 years ago into the late 1980s. Arlington County only worried about this from a health and safety perspective, meaning solid waste management. It was a fundamental government service that was provided for in the tax base, and we just focused on trash collection, and in the fall we would get leaf collection. Now, also interesting enough, in 1989 is when the EPA came up with the solid waste dilemma and agenda for action, and that's the first time they talked about this waste hierarchy. And at the time, it was really talking about complementary use of these different things, and EPA later evolved that complementary intertwined circles into the kind of pyramid that we're all familiar with today. So over the last 35 years up till now, this is kind of where we are. We're still worried about health and safety from a community perspective. We've switched over to user fees, so the people who are getting the services are actually paying for the services, and we're not burdening the rest of the community. We do talk about services because people want convenient, comprehensive, cost-effective services because we are all busy. And as I'll talk to you a little bit later, time is that most important element that people have to try to manage on a daily basis. So the other things we're trying to do is promote sustainable materials management. We want to promote the EPA waste hierarchy. We want to promote the EPA food waste hierarchy. We have a whole bunch of broader sustainability goals and efforts going on in the county: circular economy, extended producer responsibility, climate change, with a whole bunch of greenhouse gas reduction plans. And we do have a focus on environmental justice. But ultimately, we want to optimize our system to make it as good as it possibly can be. So the people on the solid waste committee have seen this slide before. I think it's important that people understand. The left side is what solid waste managers don't control directly. This is what producers generate, and this is what consumers purchase and how they interact with those products that are being developed. That is where the biggest changes can and should be made, because it's all about what people consume. When we talk about, reduce and reuse, those are consumer behaviors. Again, I can't go out there and force people to do those things. I can educate them about what's available. I can make more opportunities available. But the reality is, as far as production of materials and the use of those materials, that really is outside the purview of solid waste managers. Now, when we get over to the right side, you can just see a whole bunch of stuff. And I want people to understand just how difficult intertwined these various things are. When you talk about trash and recycling and compost and food scraps and shredding operation for managing paper and waste to energy and landfilling and all these various things, it is a challenging construct. But again, the right-hand side is what we try to do. And so once it comes over to the municipal solid waste stream, we try to manage it most effectively to the highest use. So I just want to put this out there to talk about things a little bit more in context. Everybody hears about San Francisco and how great they are. Well, they report an 80% recycling rate. The reality is it's really only 61%. They are taking credit for land applied biosolids. We have land applied biosolids. We don't take credit for that. They also do some aggregate reuse. So they have a 61% diversion rate. Arlington County is 47. The difference, from 52 to 47% is we get 5% positive on our recycling rate for doing education outreach, some other waste diversion programs. So our true recycling rate is 47%. But again, you can see when we talk about cost, regulation, enforcement, convenience, and time, do you want the carrot approach or do you want the stick approach? And again, they achieve different results. Arlington's traditionally been the carrot people as opposed to the stick people. And I think that's where kind of the world is right now. People are taking one of those two approaches in how they're managing solid waste holistically. But you can see that we have gone with kind of this Cadillac version. I would say that we have the most comprehensive collection system in the metropolitan DC area. If you put it out, basically, we're going to try to manage it responsibly. But you also see that we size the containers to make sure we're meeting the need from a community health and safety perspective. Now, other jurisdictions such as San Francisco have said, wait a minute, we want to really downsize things to make you work for it. So if you put cardboard outside their recycling container, you have to pay an additional fee for it. We don't want to do that. We want to make it fairly easy because, again, it goes back to time and people trying to figure out how much of their day they want to spend on managing solid waste. So we get back to this whole thing about convenience. So I just want to throw up here, this is what the services are that are offered to the residential population in Arlington County. We actually manage the multifamily commercial through the regulatory, through our county code, but we provide direct services, we manage contract services, but you can see it's a very comprehensive list of services that we provide to our community. Now, that doesn't happen unless there's some kind of infrastructure on the back end. And you heard Sophia talk about they're looking at how they're going to manage this material and that material. If you look at this thing, if you look at the pie chart to the left, when we look at all the waste stream combined, we know that about 22% of what put in the trash, recycling, all the different programs is stuff that we can't manage from a recycling, compost, food scraps recovery program. And that's where residents have to step up. Industry has to step up to help us shrink that 22% down to 10%. We're doing a good job of capturing things and we know what's in various waste streams. We are having some challenges with our trash. We know that about 60% of what people throw in the black cart has some recyclability to it, whether it could just go in the blue cart that everybody has, or whether they can take, plastic bags back to the grocery store, those kind of things, where they can donate clothing. But again, we know what's in the waste stream. We know that because we do quarterly waste audits and we talk about data. That's an incredibly important tool and mechanism for us, because we see the success when we implement a program. We know over time how much of that decreases or moves from one container to the next. And a prime example was when we introduced the organics cart. We had about 23% of organics that was going in the black cart. When we introduced the cart, we are now consistently 1% or less in what's going into the black cart. So by measuring it, understanding it, you can see that your programs, your education efforts are being successful. But on the right-hand side, I just want people to see the number of facilities that are actually required to make this thing work. So we have a MRF that actually sorts the single stream recycling. We collect metal separately, so we have a metal processor. We collect glass separately for drop off, and we have a glass processor that comes and gets it and actually recycles our glass in the bottles, which is something we were concerned about. And that's why we pulled it from the recycling, because the MRFs weren't processing glass, it was going to landfills. And now we have a successful drop off program. MXI handles our HHM, and they also are part of the paint recovery program. So when the paint that we basically take the HHM facility is taken to them, and they actually recycle the paint as part of the contract that we have from them. Securus, Potomac eCycle, they're an e-waste processor. And so again, that's just on the recycling side. On the trash side, the county does do waste to energy. We are committed to that. We built the facility in 1988. We'll see where that goes in the future. And we use the ash monofill in Fairfax County, and they receive the ash. When you incinerate something, about 20% by weight is actually transformed into ash, and ash has to be managed somehow. And then you can see about organics, food scraps. We have a Free State Farms, which is a composting facility. And then we have our own little earth products recycling yard, where we take back leaves and brush and other things and mulches that are available to the county. The county recently implemented a land disturbance regulation. And so we're actually making topsoil, and the method or the methodology behind that is that we just want to re-nutrify the soils. If the soils are healthier, the plants are healthier, and then the carbon sequestration is greater and those kind of things. So we're contributing to that effort from an organics management perspective in the LDA 2.0. So also just hard to handle. We know there are things that we just don't handle, whether it be mattresses, carpet, those kind of things. And so ultimately we're looking at a charm facility at some point to facilitate those things being successfully managed in our waste stream. So back in 2013, we had a new county board chairman come in, and he said, hey, I want to do something about zero waste. So we tried to say what makes sense. Well, in 2038, our contract with Covanta Energy expires. And we were told that our tip fee was going to go up dramatically. And so we were incentivized because, again, cost is money, and people, sharing those costs. We want to drive the amount of generation down. And that's why we said zero waste planning with a 90% diversion is the way to do that. If you're diverting more things away from incineration into other more viable, hierarchical uses, that's important for us. And that was the driver behind this. And so then in 2015, the county board adopted a zero waste resolution that basically said, we want you to go ahead and divert 90% from incineration or in landfilling. And again, they wanted us to work with our solid waste committee and our residents to actually come up with a zero waste plan, which is part of the state's requirement for a solid waste management plan. And these are quickly just what the solid waste management planning requirements are. You can see some basic planning requirements. It's a 20-year document that kind of tells us kind of how we're going to do this, and we use it as a roadmap. You can talk about, there's a lot of encyclopedic data as far as population, estimates of generation, those kinds of things. Again, there's a lot of basic stuff in there, but the objectives and other things are things we have some latitude around. So what does it take to get to zero waste? And you talked about the other people talking about these things. You need to establish the goal. You need to build that community commitment to actually achieving it, because it costs money, it costs resources, it costs time. We want to provide the resources to achieve the goal, building the processing infrastructure, building that collection system that actually maximizes the utilization of the system. And then The hardest thing is building participation in the system, getting the public to actually use those systems that currently exist. And that's the biggest challenge we're finding now. And then lastly is to address the difficult to manage things. So from our process, what we did is we went and looked at what other communities were doing. We're not the first one to have a zero waste plan. We also talked about a consultant about how we best communicate with the public. We looked at the waste stream and kind of go, okay, this is what it looks like. This is the national waste stream. You saw what our county waste stream looked like previously. And then we basically went through this process, reduction through behavior change, create process and disposal infrastructure, the comprehensive collection system. We want to bans potentially if that would make sense. So we banned organics from the black cart because we gave them a green cart to put organics in. So we want to make it an option as opposed to a real ban. We don't want to just ban it without them having an option to do something. And then we want to manage those hard to do things. So we have a solid waste committee, as Carrie talked about. It's a broad representation of the community. You can just see it slightly there. We are right now in the process with the goal of having the plan adopted in June of 2024. We're right now still talking about prioritization of our various proposals and ideas. These are the things that we're talking about. And it's interesting, we did basically a diversion impact because we have to get to 90%. We talked about the greenhouse gas impact. We actually talked a lot about cost because someone has to pay for it. And then we talked about the estimated time frame. And so the biggest two things that we can do as a community are use the systems that exist and manage food scraps and organics most effectively. That potentially is 28% on our rate. It take us from 52% to 80%, which would be, stellar. And so we're hoping that we can ultimately achieve those goals in the long term. But this is what the committee is working on, a whole bunch of different good ideas that came in. We reached out to the community, asked them for their ideas, and we have a consultant kind of doing the background and kind of the analysis behind the scenes. Education outreach, as I talked to, this is really the key. We do an extensive education program to the public all the time. And then we also are very honest about, when recycling was problematic because of China sword and other disruptions, we wanted to tell them what the impacts are and what the facts were. And so we're trying to be very upfront with our community. And this is really the bottom line. Zero waste do not happen without everybody's participation and commitment. And that's whether it be King County, Washington, Baltimore, Maryland, or Arlington County. It's all the same. We're all trying to do the same thing. There is no magic bullet. It's a matter of just working hard, finding out what's working in other communities, and basically copying people to be successful. And that's it, Carrie. I'm right at 15 minutes.
Gosh, so much information. And, it's clear, it's so interesting to hear from three different jurisdictions. We have different state ecosystems, different legislative, home rule, Dillon rule states. And so we have different environments in which we work. And it is interesting to hear the different initiatives and innovations that are happening in each of the three of them. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask one or two, maybe three questions, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. A lot have been coming in the chat. We're focusing on, and Eric reinforced the fact that we really need to focus on the reduce and reuse before we put materials into the system, because that's the only way we are going to reduce our waste stream and divert from the incinerator and the landfill. So I'm wondering, and I invite any of the three speakers to respond. What incentives and strategies have you adopted or are considering to promote businesses that would support reuse, refill, repair, and other services supporting a circular economy? Because those will all help us get there. Anyone?
I could talk to that for a second. That's one of the things the committee is actually talking about. The challenge is, where does the money come from? You have to have this basic funding source, and we have a full cost recovery household solid waste rate. We have an inspection fee for the multifamily commercial to make sure they're doing their piece. But when you start adding things, you got to figure out where the money comes from. And so that's where the challenge comes to the solid waste committee. Say, hey, board, we either need a financing mechanism, whether it be, like a stormwater utility or a solid waste utility tax, or just a lump sum that the general fund is going to provide to these programs on an annual basis. But again, the board allocates funds on an annual basis based on, what the economic situation is. But I do think it's important that, again, this committee ultimately work to kind of figure out what are those things that we think make the biggest impact, and then try to figure out that funding source for it.
Thanks, Eric. Andy, I wonder if you could comment. I loved hearing about the co-creation for circularity, circular economy grants. If we in Arlington had grant money fall to us and could do something like that, how has that experience been? And do you think it has really helped to promote the reuse repair ecosystem in King County?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think generally, so when we think about this on the spectrum of engagement, so if the spectrum of engagement for a public entity on one end is that you're just telling communities what's going to happen, and on the other end of the spectrum, you're asking communities, what should we as a public entity work on? Generally, we find that we're sort of skewed towards that sort of inform end of the spectrum, so around consultation at most. We're trying to move to a system where community is really much more in the driving seat of the work that we do, and it's a work in progress. I for sure cannot say that we have been super successful, but I think on the grants, what we set out to do is and we had consultant support to help set this up, so a local consultancy called Cascadia, and also a national consultancy called RRS. And we convened a group that reflected CBOs, stakeholders, businesses, and asked the question, what is it that you need? And the answer to that then helped us inform what these circular economy grants look like. But just to reflect slightly on sort of Eric's point, so our funding is generally from our ratepayer. So we're a wholesaler, so we run the landfill and transfer station network, and then we charge that to haulers, and then the haulers charge the cities, and the cities charge the residents. So it's a bit of a sort of a daisy chain. But if we deliver our objective of zero waste, then our funding source dries up. So part of the work that we're doing at the moment is actually just to think about our rate differently and constructing our rate differently. And I would definitely sort of recommend sort of doing both at the same time. So making sure there's a sustainable funding source for work, and then also sort of engaging community, so they're sort of at the more at the center of the process. I'd also like to note, and this is sometimes very, very challenging for public entities, essentially to give up the power. So we have a sort of a duty to make sure that funding is spent appropriately and consistently, but actually sometimes we exercise that control by sort of interfering far too much on decision-making processes. So one of the things that we're wanting to do more of is a program called participatory budget making, and I don't know if you have that in Arlington already, but is essentially sort of setting out a budget and then a process by which you then identify from community what that budget should be spent on. And other than making sure that the minimum standard of legal oversight and scrutiny is maintained, you're essentially sort of handing over power. Parts of King County are already doing that, so our Department of Local Services is doing it, and we're hoping to investigate how that might work in the solid waste space. So I would definitely say it's a work in progress.
Sounds like direct democracy budgeting. We don't have that here yet, but Sophia, you're certainly in a bottom-up environment, or at least that's how we sort of heard it here in the audience, I think. Do you see a flourishing of the repair reuse culture? And I guess I was very impressed to see that the mayor of Baltimore endorsed the Baltimore Fair Development Plan for Zero Waste, which was a community-driven plan. And it reads and looks like a community-driven plan, but yet it's endorsed by the Baltimore City. What can you tell me about repair reuse in Baltimore?
Yeah, so our repair and reuse businesses have actually, just in conversations with them, they've done a lot better since the pandemic hit, which is cool to see. There's a few around the city that do craft material donations, and then they sell those. There's people who repair vintage furniture and sell those. There's the Baltimore Tool Library, which is a tool rental and donation and reuse center. One of the things that we're thinking about doing to support them is create a reuse directory where we can point people to all of the places where they can donate very specific types of materials, or where if they don't want to buy something brand new, they can go to buy something secondhand in different industries. And so thinking about, the reuse guide, but then also I think we're curious about doing a feasibility study for an enterprise fund model. We are funded through general funds right now, and could use additional revenue to build the kind of infrastructure that we need. It's doing everything we need to do through general funds has proven to be really challenging, especially with our current priorities that surround compliance and landfill expansion. So there's one more thing. There was a bill. There was a bill that was introduced last year. I don't know if it'll be reintroduced this year. It was SB 631, which was it was a right to repair bill for electronic equipment. So definitely looking at the legislative support as well.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm looking at the clock, and the time is moving along. And Jackie, if you have at the ready any audience questions, I would invite you to give one to the speakers. And speakers can feel answer quickly if they'd like.
Absolutely. Well, this one was initially directed towards Andy, but I think anybody can really answer it. The impact of China's ban on receiving waste and recyclables. What was the impact, and what were the solutions?
Yeah, that was a great question. I mean, I think the county sort of initially set up. I put the link in the chat, but it was the Responsible Recycling Task Force. It was pulled from members of which were jurisdictions in our system, our partners, the haulers, and there was a series of deep dives into what needs to happen in order to bring about a responsible recycling system. Many of those things are kind of very similar to what you would need to do sort of in circularity, and very similar to the things we're talking about. And really that work evolved into then the sort of RePlus work that we're doing. I think one of, two of the things that were particularly sort of impactful was one, the sort of, the collapse in end markets meant that cost recovery was particularly challenging. And so we started to see that there were additional fees placed on jurisdictions and also ratepayers in order to sort of make up the shortfall. We're starting to see less and less of those. And then second, I think there was a really deliberate attempt to find markets domestically. So what we find now, as an example, so our collection contracts with haulers for our transfer stations, we now require there to be downstream due diligence as part of contract management. So we get reported on the places where materials are sent. That's hugely important, I think, for helping to build confidence in the system. So when materials are collected and they go into the transfer station system, when sold into a market, they're not being sold into a place where residents of King County would not be happy to. So the vast majority of material is now sold in North America. As I said, I put a link to that in the chat. It's a bit further up, so hopefully there'll be plenty on our website that people can take a look at.
Thanks, Andy. Anyone else want to take that on? I think that maybe was a pretty comprehensive answer. why don't I jump in with another question from the moderator? I know this is not your jobs, but if you could conceive of certain product design practices that could change, and what would be most effective in reducing waste, promoting reuse, and ensuring efficient recycling?
Carrie, if you mind if I don't, or I'll start. I think the challenge has always been connecting the dots. We have the material recovery facilities of MRF who sort through the material, who aren't always talked to by the people who are doing the manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to link those. So when someone says, I'm making this thing, if we were to mandate to say, it has to be recycled on the back end or whatever parameters we're going to put in place, because in many circumstances, they don't do that. So all of a sudden they have this thing and they're trying to jam it into the recycling system that the recycling system is not prepared to accept. And so I just think, and we've talked about that from the solid waste management side of things, how important it is that the designers and manufacturers of things are talking to the people who are managing it on the back end to make sure it's something they can actually manage and support and ultimately sell. I mean, it's not recyclable unless there's a market for it. And so that's why the circularity is critically important.
Right. I think that's the beauty of the extended producer responsibility legislation efforts to expand that, because if you are responsible for taking care of the waste of products you produce, then you're going to design it differently. I have a strong feeling. Any others want to weigh in on that topic?
Yeah, not to, Sophia, I don't know if you wanted to, and I'm sorry for talking so much, but absolutely 100% what Eric said. I mean, not to sort of be the ghost of Christmas future, but things like PFAS, which are coming at us very, very quickly and are literally everywhere. For me, if I was sort of a policymaker and could wave a sort of a federal magic wand, I would have an extended producer responsibility that is like a framework that would allow us to add materials to that extended producer responsibility framework. Because what we want is that folk who are making design decisions get the signal being in this case costs, needing to deliver cleanup of those materials. So for me, it's really to sort of embed that polluter pays principle into sort of much more of the work that we do. And I think that really then foreshadows what is the next sort of the version of China sword that we have, which is the crisis that might come when the full impacts of things like PFAS are fully understood and folk are wanting to make claims. Like we're starting to see that now with the sort of hundreds of lawsuits across the country. I think that's only going to get bigger and worse for public jurisdictions.
Andy, can you remind the audience what PFAS is?
Oh no, I'm completely gonna butcher it. It's the forever chemicals. It's like the chlorofluorolala.
Okay,
I'm really ashamed that I'm not.
You explained it. Yeah, that's good. That's well enough. So Jackie, more audience questions for us. I realize that some of it is being answered in the chat, perhaps, and I'm not monitoring it directly.
Yeah. Are there particular strategies for working with the public school systems in Arlington? I think there's been some pushback that the schools want to focus on the curriculum. So is there some strategy or secret sauce to get buy-in from the schools?
So what we have done in the past is we have a county code, which actually is what sets the rules. And we have required all people or all businesses that operate, to include county schools, to basically do basic recycling. That would be the mechanism that we would then use to change the county code to require food scraps management by the multifamily and commercial sector. Now, the solid waste committee is not there yet. I'm going to have another discussion with them tomorrow night or on Thursday night talking about that specifically. But I don't think we can get there necessarily voluntarily. There's a cost associated with these programs. And as the schools are most inclined to do, they say, we have other priorities. And again, we need to figure out what that cost is, if the taxpayer is willing to pay that additional monies to source the schools with the resources to do this kind of thing. And so that is what's traditionally happened when we basically require them to do recycling. They got additional revenues to deal with that program. But it is a challenge in schools because schools is always trying to say, we need the money to educate the kids, and no one's going to argue with that. But again, they are a large generator of food scraps. And again, there's even talk of more expansion to the breakfast programs in the schools, the lunch programs, after school programs. So they are generating a whole bunch of food scraps. And again, one is, again, to educate them to not waste food in the first place, but then this material we do recover, what is the best use of that material, whether it be for hog farms or other things like that, and then get them on board with actually doing that program. But it will be a process, and I would imagine over time we will get there. It may not happen as fast as I would like.
Sophia, do you have any observation on the role that the public schools or schools in general are playing in Baltimore in this regard?
Yeah, so we have a liaison officer in the Office of Waste Diversion whose primary job it is to just do composting and recycling education in schools. And our primary vehicle within schools is their green teams. So schools will kind of have these teacher leads who lead their green teams, who are responsible for a lot of the environmental programs at the school. They definitely run into staffing and resource issues, and that's something that we're continually looking to support and infuse with more resources. But things like share tables in the schools is something that we've done for food waste reduction. The pandemic kind of shut that down for a while, but I think they're starting to share tables up again. Also, we're thinking about doing trainings for food producers, food processors, that would train them on the back of line practices to divert food waste, which is a big problem for them. They need somebody to train their back of house staff, and then also somebody to stand and help the kids separate source organics and the front of house. And so we're thinking about ways to both track and train front of line and in the front of line and back of line. Yeah.
Thanks, Sophia. One other question from me, and then I'm going to turn it back to audience questions. All three of you have mentioned construction and demolition waste. Andy, it seemed to me in King County you have an interesting outreach to exchange with education of the construction developer community on best possible disposal of construction and demolition waste. I'm interested in any further observations about that and how we could do better on that, because here in Arlington, as somebody commented in the chat, we have a lot of development, a lot of construction, and we have a lot of waste. And it is an issue. It's here in Arlington. It's not Eric's within his purview to manage it, but we as a community do need to. Andy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it is particularly challenging. So in King County, we banned C&D material from our system, and through ordinance set up and requirements for material to be diverted to special sort of handling facilities, whether those are sort of accredited MRFs or transfer station systems. We also have and work very closely with regional jurisdictions in the state in order to sort of apply building codes. And I think, if the general theme is more upstream, one of the ways in construction and demolition to go upstream is around deconstruction. I think there's loads of interesting things that are sort of happening all over the place, but in particular, Oregon and Portland have been doing interesting things on the role of deconstruction, especially in creating, materials like salvaged wood, etc., and sort of having a salvage material network. I think there's much more that we can be doing on that. We fund lots of that work by having a rate on that we charge, like a tipping fee on materials that are taken to special designated facilities, and then we have an enforcement system by which we will do sort of random inspections. And so the team sits within solid waste, and we sort of see it as a way for us to make sure we're hitting our zero wasted resources goal, which was that 70%, by kind of funding a system that keeps material out of our system. And that's why one of the challenges of sort of long-term sustainable funding is one that we're having to grapple with at the moment, because the more successful our programs are, the less funds we have for our programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do either of the other two speakers want to comment on that? Otherwise, I can move on to other questions. Jackie, any more questions from the audience? We probably have time for.
Sure. This is probably near and dear to everyone's heart. Funding. I think Andy mentioned that there is a grant program in Kings County, and so where does that funding come from, and any suggestions for how to obtain funding for some of the other jurisdictions?
So just very specifically on that, so just about all of our funding comes from the tipping fee. So we're an enterprise fund, so we need to make sure that funds that are collected are spent on programs that's consistent with our comprehensive plan, and also making sure that we're delivering our policy objectives as set by our executive. So when we're developing grants, so the circular economy grants, the Renew Seed grants, the new schools grant that we want to bring forward, and also our city grants, these are all paid for by the fee we charge to haulers to use our system, so to use the landfill and to use the transfer station network.
Very good. Jackie, do you have any other questions at hand?
Sure. As far as single stream recycling, there were several questions about the amount of items that are contaminated because of this system of single stream. So is there an estimate of the percentage of items that are contaminated, and maybe how to reduce contamination in the single stream system?
I mean, I can answer that from Arlington's perspective. Our contamination rate is less than 11%, and that's where people are just putting the inappropriate things into the blue single stream container. As far as what happens to the material, our MRF, the new one we're going to, and even our old one, is very effective at actually capturing the things that we've asked for. Later this month, the early part of next month, we're going to send out the latest Recycle Right brochure to the residential customers, explaining what they are supposed to put in. And it really is fairly simple. It's, plastic containers and jugs 1 through 7. It's paper, cardboard, aluminum, and steel cans. And what did I miss? Newspaper, those kinds of things. But it's relatively simple, and the MRFs are designed to manage that material, so they do it very effectively. And so I don't think it's a challenge. The challenge is what people are putting in kind of the concept of wishful recycling. They think they're going to put it in a blue carton and magically is going to recycle. It's very clear what these systems can manage, and we just have to operate within what these systems actually can do. And so when you do that, our contamination rate goes down, and we've been as low as I think 7% contamination, which is really, really good. Nationally they talk about 20 to 30%, but Arlington, because of our education efforts, because of the dedication of our residents, we've done very well from minimizing the amount of contamination.
Okay, I think we've kind of come to the end of the program. I could invite, if any of the speakers have something urgent they would like to contribute in 30 seconds or so, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and close the event. I would like to sincerely thank the speakers and our own Eric Grabowski as commenter. It was a very rich discussion. It's impossible to summarize it. It's clear that There needs to be community government dialogue over this, because there's no shortage of good ideas. There is a shortage, as Eric points out, of resources, and using them in the highest priority way possible is really the goal. We've heard about a lot of very innovative practices. I would love, Allison, if there's any way we're able to capture the chat for later reading, to save it, including I'd love to bring it to the Solid Waste Committee meeting. Any ideas there? But again, thanks very much to the speakers, to those who are managing Zoom, Allison, others. I'm going to turn it over now to Dean, just for a very quick wrap up.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. If Joan can put up, we have a slide of upcoming events, and if she can get that up there, that would be great. And while we're waiting for that, again, I would second what was just said about the wonderful speakers, and the wonderful moderator with Carrie, and the people behind the scenes who haven't been on camera, Joan, Catherine, Allison, and the others who made this event work so well. And it looks like we have, Catherine has put one of the upcoming events, at least, into the chat. It looks like as other upcoming events are coming into the chat. And there's also one by Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions on the 27th, the 2023 Climate Solutions Kickoff. And you can find 3 other events that Eco Action Arlington is putting on in January and February, listed in the chat. And with that, it is 8:30. I would like to thank all of our participants, and again, the speakers. Have a good evening.